This program, of course, is presented by Pro Wrestling Illustrated, the most widely read, widely sold, and respected wrestling magazine in the world today.
This is a Pro Wrestling Illustrated podcast. I'm your host, PWI senior writer Al Castle. Going to be joined in just a moment by my co-host, Brian Solomon, and also PWI senior writer Harry Burkett back on the show. And we are going to be discussing the PWI Decade Awards. So we just got past our Year in Wrestling issue where, as usual, we give out all our achievement awards, Wrestler of the Year, Match of the Year, and so on and so forth. But now, just coming off of the close of a decade, the latest issue of Pro Wrestling Illustrated features the Decade Awards and all those same categories that you're used to seeing in our annual Achievement Awards issue, Year in Wrestling issue. We cover for the decade. So a big issue, we're going to cover it all in just a moment, and then after that, we're going to hear from the Wrestler of the Decade as chosen by you, the PWI readers. You might have heard of him, none other than AJ Styles. I got to chat with him by phone some weeks back, right after he was chosen as the Wrestler of the Decade, and we talk about his last decade in wrestling. You know, it comes as he's entering his 40s, and he's acknowledged that he's closer to the end of his career than the beginning, and I think this last decade in particular was really kind of career-defining when you think about him beginning in Impact Wrestling, his runs through Ring of Honor in New Japan, and then finally ending up on WWE and everything he's accomplished there over the last 4 years. So a lot to cover, a really fun conversation. You'll want to check it out. And that comes after my discussion with Harry and Brian, where we go over all the awards and some surprises. As you'll hear in a moment, my first reaction was maybe that fans weren't totally on the mark, but as we discussed all of it, I really came around, and I think actually fans did a really good job of condensing 10 years of wrestling into these awards. So you'll want to stay tuned for that conversation. And if you want to read this special issue, and I'm always here plugging issues as being collector's editions, and a lot of them are, but this one in particular, obviously, once every 10 years do you get something like this where we look back on a whole decade, so you do not want to miss this one. I mean, if the Year in Wrestling is an issue that you don't miss, as I never did, from when I was a kid, that was always a go-to issue, but this even more so. So tons of stuff in this issue. Again, all the categories that you're used to reading in the Achievement Awards issue, we go over here. So you're talking Match of the Decade, Tag Team of the Decade, Most Inspirational Wrestler of the Decade, and so on. So if you want to check all those out, you don't want to miss the issue, go to pwi-online.com. The digital edition is available now. You can get it weeks before the print edition, so you go ahead and download it or subscribe. If you subscribe, you get deeper savings. You can get half off the cover price. And that goes for both the print and digital edition, but the digital edition you get a lot faster. So that's definitely a leg up on the print edition. But again, either way, go to pwi-online.com. Can't say enough about this issue. A lot of work went into it. And, one of the cool things about Pro Wrestling Illustrated now in our 41st year is that you could go back and grab any issue, and it is a snapshot in time, kind of a little time capsule of wrestling, where wrestling was when that issue came out. And this one, because it does cover not just a decade, but I think a really transformative decade in a lot of ways. And Harry and Brian and I discussed that in a bit. I mean, it was the decade where the business model for how wrestling is presented in terms of moving away from pay-per-view, over-the-top streaming, where that happened, AEW obviously last year, but so much more. Even you go into those early years of the decade, which I know some fans have kind of forgotten about and moved past, but you think about stuff like Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker, kicking off the 2010s with their rematch at WrestleMania, so much more. So the women's evolution, everything that's happened with all the other companies, Impact, Ring of Honor, New Japan over the last 10 years. So a super, super historic, transformative decade for wrestling. And I don't think you'll see it encapsulated anywhere as well as in the pages of our magazine. So again, please go to pwi-online.com and pick it up. While you're there, please drop us a line here. You can send us an email at pwi@kappapublishing.com with any questions, concerns, comments about what we do in the magazine or anywhere else. If you want to send us something directly here to the podcast, PWI Podcast at outlook.com. Please also follow us on social media. At official PWI is our handle on Twitter and Instagram. You could also find us on Facebook. You can and absolutely should subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts, iTunes or anywhere else. We've been hosted by Podbean for a number of years. You could go there and subscribe. Wherever you do, we certainly appreciate a kind review. And also pick up the PWI t-shirt. I saw my new co-host, Brian Solomon, sporting his brand new shirt, and they really are super cool. You've got a lot of options for colors and things like that, but I'm guessing the vast majority go with the red shirt with the white lettering. It's really kind of the iconic PWI t-shirt that you saw a lot of the biggest names in the sport wear back in the 80s, and it's back now. You can pick yours up by going to ProWrestlingTees.com. All right, joined right now by my co-host. It's still going to take a little while to get used to. Brian Solomon. How are you, Brian?
I'm okay, Al, and thanks for keeping me on after the first one.
Yes, and back once again talking about looking back on the decade, my fellow senior writer, Harry Burkett. How are you, Harry?
Great to be back, and it's great to speak to Brian. It's been a very long time.
Is that right? Am I connecting you two, reuniting you two?
Yeah, I feel like I've known you for years, and this is the first time we're actually speaking to each other.
Well,
yeah, I think we talked a few years ago, actually, but it's been quite a while.
Oh, God, yeah.
Bringing people together here on the PWI Podcast.
Thank you, Al.
Yeah, that's right.
And as I touched on last time we were talking, Harry, we were talking about some of the big stories of the decade that was. Today, we're going to be looking at some decade awards. So this latest issue that's just coming out now, every year we do a look back on the year in wrestling. In this case, we look back on the decade in wrestling, and we put a ballot out to readers, and you voted, and we've got the awards in front of us. So we're going to be talking a bit about that. Harry, you put this together. Can I ask, when we talked, were you in the middle of doing this, or had it not yet been all compiled? I'm curious how, if at all, putting this all together maybe change your perspective?
Well, yeah, I'm thinking back to that podcast, and I remember how comprehensive your memory is going back 10 years. And I don't think I had begun this assignment yet. I think one thing that kind of surprised me was the voting, and we'll get into this later, particularly the Wrestler of the Year awards. And I remember having a different view than what the readers ultimately ended up having. But upon review, I will not question the wisdom of the readers, because looking back at it, I have to agree with the final result.
Yeah, I'm just seeing them for the first time a few minutes before we're recording here. So I've got some thoughts. I do think, and this happens in kind of all avenues, when you look back on something as pronounced as a whole decade, I think there is some recency bias. I do think that you see a lot of it weighted to the last several years, and maybe not as much an appreciation of the first few years, with some exceptions that we'll get into. But Brian, in a nutshell, when what are some of the lasting memories for you, whether it's matches or standout wrestlers? What defines 2000? What are we talking? It's not the awesome, it's the 10s, right? 2010 to 2019.
Yeah, I was actually going to gently correct you there, right? the aughts was the first decade. Now it's the teens that we just finished, and we're starting the 20s. So this kind of recency bias that you mentioned is something that I also was thinking as I was looking over it, because it's very tempting to just be thinking about the, stuff that's happened in the past few years. And I have to say, looking at a lot of them, I feel like that didn't happen too much. Like, for example, for inspirational,
Let's not give anything away just yet.
Oh, okay. All right. I don't want to give them away. All right. Well, let me just say that there's someone there that I would have picked as my choice, but then I stop and I think about it, and it's really based on something that happened in the past couple of years. I still would have voted for that person. And that happened a few times where I was kind of thinking, okay, just because something happened recently, it doesn't necessarily mean that it still isn't the most important thing that happened the entire decade, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the fans got this closer to correct than I'm giving them credit for. So let's jump into it. Let me pull up my list, and maybe we'll start from I guess we'll work our way up to the top categories right here. Where are they? Okay, so why don't we just start with what you just touched on, Brian? Harry, why don't you tell us who the most inspirational wrestler of the decade was?
Well, that man was Daniel Bryan with 34% of the vote. And one thing that struck me was how he's been inspirational to us on multiple occasions. You can include the Yes movement that culminated at WrestleMania 30 and the Yes chant. Then the fact that he had to retire due to CTE concerns, and he did that with such grace. And, he got a lot of kudos for the way he handled that. And then the way he came back, I wasn't expecting him to ever come back to the ring, but apparently the medical professionals thought he could continue in the ring, and he's back. And arguably a fourth factor is his most recent run, where he did away with the new Daniel Bryan attitude, and now he's more like his old self. That's almost like a throwback to what the inspirational wrestler of the year used to be, when it used to be a rule breaker generally who saw the light.
Yeah, I do think fans got this one right, and I think you tell a good tale of why that is, and how really his inspirational acts were multiple and were spread out throughout the decade. And I'll add another one. I guess it would be a fifth one, and I'd have to look at exactly the timeline. But just getting a start in WWE, right? I remember watching Daniel Bryan on Ring of Honor, on The Independents, and sort of like AJ Styles some years later, he was the guy that, fans were clamoring. I don't remember how many years in a row he won Outstanding Wrestler of the Year in the Observer Awards. And it was just sort of, when is he finally going to get a break? And what was holding him back, obviously, was his size. And just making it to the main roster. And I do think that was right in the beginning of the decade, because it coincided with Nexus, right? And the Nexus was like 2010, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Right. And a couple of failed attempts before that, where he'd been in the developmental program in Memphis, like in the early 2000s, and he was cut from that. So I think that was actually his third attempt by the time he got to 2010.
Yeah, so absolutely an inspirational decade for Daniel Bryan. Brian, you said you had somebody else in mind when you first heard this award?
Yeah, I have to say that I think 10 years from now, let's say, if we look back on this, I think people may look back on it and say that Cody Rhodes deserved it. Mm-hmm. And the reason is because, yes, this only happened the past couple of years of the decade, but I feel like what he has accomplished by literally just saying, okay, WWE, you're not going to treat me the way I want to be treated. You're not going to push me the way I envision what I deserve. I'm going to go out. I'm going to find somebody with enough money, and I'm going to start a company to compete against you, and I'm going to succeed. And he actually did it. And I think, like, in the grand scheme of things, in terms of wrestling history and this kind of thing, we haven't seen anything like this in 20 years. And for me personally, kind of watching it grow from something people laughed at, with All In, till now, and winning the NWA title, starting AEW, the match with Dustin, everything, the promos he's been doing, I think if he had been doing this for the entire decade or the majority of it, it wouldn't even be close.
Yeah, I really agree. For what it's worth, I believe he is the fourth runner-up, right? So in order, Daniel Bryan comes in first with 34% of the vote. Second place, John Cena at 13% of the vote. Roman Reigns, 12%, and Cody I guess he would be the third runner-up in fourth place at 7%. So does make the list, maybe not as high as some of us would have expected. But I don't have a huge problem with anybody on that list. John Cena. Harry, what do you see as the case for how inspirational John Cena was over the last decade?
Well, I think early in the decade, he had a few injuries, like a torn triceps, and to recall, he came back in just a couple of months, which was incredible. And I think it boils down to Make-A-Wish and the fact that he never turned heel. He just stayed focused on being a great ambassador for WWE. And you have to say he really hasn't made the scandal tabloid, unlike someone like Hulk Hogan, who had ups and downs, and he's had major issues in that regard. I think he's just been a great ambassador for wrestling.
Yeah, well said. Next up, we've got most popular wrestler of the decade, and I guess on that point, who was the most popular wrestler of the decade, Harry?
John Cena at 20%, but it was very, very close, within a percentage point.
Yeah, I see that. And the first runner-up both 20%. So I guess it was a matter of just a handful of votes.
Right, and John Cena, consider this factoid. He repeated as most popular wrestler of the decade. He was the most popular wrestler in the 2000s and also the 2010s. Wow. So that's some dominance there.
Yeah, and again, I think fans got this right, but I'm surprised to hear that it was even that close. That statistically speaking, it was almost a tie between him and the first runner-up being Daniel Bryan. To me, that's a no-brainer. And again, I wonder whether there's some recency bias here, because certainly at least in the first half of the decade, and understanding that you could argue that his peak came before, and I don't think it did. I think it was right into the first several years of this decade. But John Cena was a phenomenon, and I think because there always was that booing section, you take for granted how loud the cheering section was. And honestly, that's only one metric that you could even look at when evaluating somebody's popularity. I don't think since Steve Austin did you see anything near like the merchandise that he was selling. And even now in the last several years, kind of post full-time WWE, in some ways he's become even more popular because he did make that transition into the mainstream successfully. So to me, this is a no-brainer, and I don't see it as even being that close. How about you, Brian?
Well, I think what makes it competitive at all is it has to do with the fact that he has been so dominant and popular in two different decades, but it's sort of been, like you said, we're really talking about 2005 to like 2015. Like if that was a decade, which it sort of is, but if that was like an actual decade, it would be unquestionable, like an iron grip. But I feel like just as in the first half of the 2000s, he was kind of on the rise for a few years before he really hit main event level. The same thing for like the last 4 or 5 years, he's been sort of gradually being phased out. And so I think that opens the door to other people like Daniel Bryan, who, had some really high moments, kind of challenging him for that spot. But all things considered, he is, in my opinion, the one and only choice. I mean, even in terms of, it's been shown that in this age when it's all about the brand, his name in the advertisements will sell house show tickets to a degree that if he's not on the show, they don't do as well in filling those seats. And that's really amazing in this day and age where it seems like it's not even relevant anymore.
Yeah. And certainly timely. He made his return last week on television, that show closing angle with Bray Wyatt heading into WrestleMania. And the word is, biggest audience of the night. Certainly the pop was huge. I'm sure it helped that he was there in his hometown of Boston. But I think people forget sometimes what a star he was. I mean, I remember for the first several years of that decade, taking my kids when they were small to see WWE shows. We still go, but now they're a little older, a little more jaded. But my kids in that kind of toddler into the early kind of school years, basically talking like 3 to 7 or 8, they were crazy about him, and not even that much fans of wrestling, but he just had a way of captivating kids. He was in a weird way kind of reminds me of the guy who was that to me when I was a kid, which is the Ultimate Warrior. But it was the entrance, it was the color, it was all the flash. Fans couldn't get enough of it. And I think people forget what a sensation John Cena was. And it's sort of appropriate this comes up to WrestleMania season, because I think people are about to be reminded of and not just in terms of popularity, but it's a different category, but how much he could go in that ring. So we'll talk about that in a bit. Also, next up, well, just to round out who the runners up here were. So you have John Cena and Daniel Bryan in the 1 and 2 spots. Number 3, AJ Styles. 4, CM Punk, and others were 40%. So a good deal of distribution. And any names come to mind that don't make that aren't on those top vote getters, Harry, that maybe would be in the running?
Oh my goodness. Trying to think. I was about to say Dean Ambrose / John Moxley,
sure. Mm-hmm.
But I don't think he'll even crack that top 4.
No. Roman Reigns is an interesting one because obviously, post John Cena, he was supposed to be the guy, but actually ended up, I think a little bit of history he made during the decade was winning most hated wrestler of the year as a babyface. So that speaks to that not really having quite gone right. That's changed a little bit over the last year, but I think Dean Ambrose is a good one, both for his, his AEW work. The last year of it would have been within a decade, but Dean Ambrose was also a super popular act in WWE as well. Trying to think earlier in the decade, you could make an argument for the Rock, who worked a couple of WrestleManias.
Go with somebody that was so part-time and really only kind of cherry picking their appearances.
No, but it's also kind of an indictment, and not the only one, in WWE's inability to really make babyface stars, and again, that's certainly also been in the news as of late with the Saudi show last week, and seeing who are the guys who came out on top, guys like Undertaker and Goldberg. And on one hand I get it, on the other hand, again, kind of an indictment of their inability to create the new Undertaker and the new Goldberg over the last decade and beyond. Okay, next up we have got most hated wrestler of the decade, and Harry, who took that?
That was Brock Lesnar at 44%. And I think fans respect him as an athlete, but they hate him as champion. And he happened to be champion most of the time. And that reminds me of probably my favorite headline from the past decade, which Brock Lesnar was on the cover. And the headline was, "How to Win Wrestler of the Year in 61 Minutes."
Right. I think I was the one that did the math for that too. I remember adding up the length of all his matches.
Speaking of math, and I might have actually stole this from you, Al. Let me see. I jotted it down here somewhere. Yes, Lesnar's Universal title reign in 2017 and 18 was 504 days, but he made only 17 title defenses, with 9 of them occurring at unadvertised house shows.
Wow. Yeah. I remember when we were discussing this, I think I might have tallied up all of Brock Lesnar's matches over the decade. So basically since he came back in 2012. And I mean, I don't think he gets to 100. I think literally, John Cena probably worked more matches in the course of 4 or 5 months of his busiest stretch in the decade as Brock worked in the entire decade. And all of that said, I was just looking real quick. He won this award by the highest margin of any award winner. So, and I think as Harry touched on, it's fans respect the hell out of him, right? So, Brian, what does this tell you in terms of what his decade was? It feels like this is the right kind of heat, right?
I think it's actually a little bit of both. It's interesting to me because it's an example of how the way wrestling fandom is today. It's like a mix of playing along with the storyline and also seeing behind the curtain. And sometimes one is winning out over the other. So on the one hand, they're hating him because he's drawing that legitimate heat, like you said, largely also because he has Paul Heyman speaking for him, and he's got that heel heat that you want to get. But I feel like there's also a strong contingent of, what is sometimes referred to as X-Pac heat or Eric Bischoff heat, which is get this guy off my television, that a lot of fans feel sometimes. And I think it's a combination of both, where they're hating him from a storyline point of view, but they're also hating the fact that he's getting this push so much. So it's interesting. I mean, I think he's another one where he's the clear winner, but I also have to say that I'm very much, as I think I've said before, I'm a big Lesnar supporter, and that'll come out a little bit later on because I have a couple of possibly controversial things to say about that with some of these other awards.
Yeah. In the first runner-up spot is interesting, not a person as much as a couple or an act, and that's Triple H / Stephanie McMahon at 13%. I would think, again, this is somewhere where maybe fantasy meets reality in terms of the fans' sentiment toward them. So, Harry, what was your kind of interpretation of those two being put together and ranking so high? Is this something they should be proud of? Or, again, maybe not, maybe sort of an indictment of the wrong direction, not just for their characters, but for the company?
Yeah, you're right. I think it was basically a repeat of what Brian just said, that they made themselves the stars of the show. I guess maybe one redeeming quality is they gave Joey Mercury and Jamie Noble some steady work. And you can't really question their mic skills. They are entertaining, but when you're not the top wrestling act and you make yourself the stars of the show, that's just getting harder and harder to do. I'm sure it's harder to do today than it was when Vince McMahon was a heel in the late 90s. It's hard to get away with that.
Yeah, and they were effective heels, putting kind of reality aside and whatever resentment and hard feelings there are toward Stephanie McMahon and Paul Levesque, the executives at WWE. They were effective on-air villains, but I'm not convinced we've seen the end of it either. It got way past the point of overkill at some point, and hopefully the 2000 teens was the last of the era of the heel authority figure, because thankfully I don't think we've seen that much of that in recent months. So Brian, what's your take on those two being so high? As somebody who worked with them for a number of years, maybe you have a different perspective on whether they are in fact heels.
Yes, my gag order is removed. It's been 13 long years, so anything I signed is null and void. But yeah, I mean, it's the same as with Vince, where it is a reflection of reality to a degree that they are the authority figures. They aren't always the most pleasant people to be in charge of a company, if I may say, in a very diplomatic fashion, and they draw their characters from their personalities. I mean, they do. I have been, I have had cordial, wonderful moments with Vince McMahon. We're talking about our families and things, and I've also had moments where he was Mr. McMahon from television, and and I was I was the target of whatever he had to say at that moment. And no, he didn't fire me that way. But
did you join the club?
No, I didn't do that either. No. No, but on the Hunter and Stephanie front, yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that this is the end of the evil authority figure thing. I think it had a good 20-year run. I think we've really had enough of it. I think they finally realized that. What I hated the most about it was that they would, and this was more a Stephanie thing. It almost seemed like she was on a mission to basically kind of emasculate as much of the top talent as she possibly could, particularly baby faces, and just weaken them. And they created this kind of idea among the fans, which is reality, but I don't think it's a reality that you should accentuate, that these wrestlers are nothing more than their employees. And I think when you do that, and when you harp on that and hammer that home constantly, it sort of makes them seem lame and ineffectual. And I think it did a lot of harm.
Yeah, and I think some of that is still going on, even in the absence of an on-air authority figure, where there's just too much attention brought to the fact that these are employees who are subservient to their employers. We saw that with some of the Kevin Owens storyline last year, where and there was still the on-air authority figure at the time with Shane McMahon, but the whole kind of like pleading not to get a fine and be willing to be the heel referee to help the bad guy win because you didn't want to have to pay these fines, and it's just emasculating and just not pleasant to watch. And to go on a little bit of a tangent, and this is coming off of the AEW pay-per-view over the weekend, where one of the cooler things to watch in AEW, and just in the last few weeks we've seen more of it, is we all can rave about the work that Cody is doing in AEW, and I think it's terrific. But I think a really important part of the act, certainly as of late, has been his wife. And one thing that we have not seen in a long time, I think maybe since Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth, is the babyface power couple. I guess we saw a little bit of it last year with Becky and Seth, but that didn't last very long. But it's sort of forgotten that there's something that can be really inspirational and feel good to cheer about when you see a husband and wife on the same team supporting each other, helping each other. And it's something that we really haven't, if not ever, in the recent past, seen out of Triple H and Stephanie McMahon. And it feels like a part of the story that's never really been told. That at the end of the day, for everything that we see on air, they are a devoted husband and wife who now have been married for a number of years, raising children together. And it's a shame that them as a power couple have always been portrayed as the villains instead of something that could be kind of uplifting for fans. So I don't know. Moving on. We're going through the rest of that list. At the second runner-up spot, Roman Reigns, again, not something I think he would be proud of, nor WWE would be proud of, at 8%. Chris Jericho at 6%. And that maybe goes against my argument about recency bias, because if this was just the last year or so, I think he'd be an easy number one with the work he's done. And others got 39% of the vote. Speaking of recency bias, feud of the year. What won the top feud of the decade, Harry?
That was Okada versus Kenny Omega with 18%. And I suppose they really made their mark. It was the year 2017 when they were at the Tokyo Dome. They had that first great encounter. So basically we had our match of the year within 4 days of the new year in 2017. But then they seemingly topped that in June with the rematch. They really made history with each other. And I can't think of any feud that elevated two wrestlers so much. When you think of the fact that Okada became number one in the PWI 500, as a result of those matches. And then the following year, when Omega got his big IWGP title win over Okada, he was number one in the 500. So for those two to win back to back, that's quite a statement.
How well do you think the feud holds up? And it's interesting because you talked about how earlier the inspirational award has really kind of changed meanings over the years, and I feel like I don't know if this one's changed meanings, but I feel like once upon a time, and it still can be, but this was reserved for the rivalry that was kind of the most raw, the most volatile, to people who really hated each other, kind of the blood feud, the blood rivalry, and that wasn't really the case here. This was more about a body of work, right? It was more kind of about the art and less about the storyline between them.
I think that for me, I kind of have a problem with this one because on the one hand, I'm looking at the list of the runners up and everything, and what it tells me, unfortunately, looking at it now, which I hadn't really thought of, is that I don't think this was such a great decade for feuds in general. Because there doesn't seem to be there's no Hogan Andre, there's no Austin McMahon. There isn't a feud that you would automatically say, oh God, yeah, that feud, defines the decade here. And with the Okada Omega thing, I almost feel like it wins by default. I mean, their matches were great, but like you were saying, a feud for me, it has to be more than just a series of matches. There's got to be a really hot angle. It should be clearly face versus heel. There's got to be some real heat on it for it to be a feud. It can't just be, hey, these guys had a bunch of great matches. It's a feud of the decade. So, but again, I'm hard pressed to pick one I would choose over it. So I feel like, yeah, it wins, but it wins just because it was not a great decade for feuds.
Yeah, and I just pulled up, because I think you make a good point, all the feuds of the year over the decade, and it is kind of an underwhelming list. So I guess if do we begin at 2010 or do we begin at 2011?
I would say 2010.
10, right? Yeah, because it goes up to 19. So the 2010 feud of the year was Nexus versus WWE. 2011, CM Punk and John Cena. 2012, Aces and Eights versus TNA. I don't think that holds up that well. 2013, Daniel Bryan versus The Authority. 2014, Seth Rollins and Dean Ambrose. 2015, Undertaker versus Brock. 16, Charlotte and Sasha. 2017, Okada and Omega, which is the decade feud of the decade. 18, Gargano and Ciampa. There's one, and we'll go back to this. There's one that does feel like what you're describing, Brian. And then in 2019, I think, again, maybe to a little bit lesser extent, Adam Cole and Johnny Gargano. But, one that didn't win for any year, but did make a runner-up that I think is along the lines of what you're describing is, and maybe I would have given it to this, Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn. Before that, Kevin Owens and El Generico, a feud that really did stretch over about a decade. I wouldn't have minded seeing this in the top spot. Harry, again, anything jump out at you there in terms of all those feuds? It does feel like I just think back to the 90s and the 80s, and you see some of the winners from past years, feuds like Hulk Hogan and Paul Orndorff, or Randy Savage and DDP. These were great feuds.
Right. And I also think of like the early 80s, which predates the Feud of the Year award. I'm sort of puzzled. What are we lacking? Are we lacking blood? Are we lacking sheer hatred? Are the wrestlers not communicating evil intentions or hatred like they used to? Or is it sort of like the pay-per-view effect of, you have your program, it lasts about 3 months, and then it's over. It's not like Buzz Sawyer versus Tommy Rich, which lasted a year. And I agree with you, this Owens-Zayn rivalry, I still didn't feel like that reached its full potential in WWE, but it did harken back to those older feuds. But it does also prove that what works on the indie scene as far as chemistry also works on the bigger stage. So that's why I was glad to see that one play.
Yeah, a couple things that come to mind, when you do kind of step back and think, well, what was different about this decade that I think, as we all agree, that feuds could sort of lose some of that steam, and a couple things do come to mind. You touched on one, blood, and I think it's less the case blood and more the reliance on over scripting, where I don't think you have wrestlers able to, at least in WWE, to really kind of emote that passion, that hatred that have been so important in wrestling over the previous decades. And the other thing that I think they moved more toward in the last decade is these kind of branded pay-per-views that just follow a schedule where, for the 10 years before this, maybe even close to 20 years, a match like a Hell in a Cell or an Elimination Chamber or whatever it was, you kind of organically arrived at it by having this super hot feud. And now the Hell in a Cell match is reserved for whoever happens to be feuding in October, right? And in some cases, it's their first match, and it's put in a Hell in a Cell. So that storytelling, that kind of episodic storytelling where you layer these chapters on top of each other until you reach a climax. I'll give you another fantastic one of my all-time favorites, maybe my all-time favorite, that would have fallen in the decade before this. And I don't know, I don't have it in front of me. I'd be curious if it won Feud of the Year in the aughts. Chris Jericho and Shawn Michaels, if you remember that, just a perfect example of what I'm talking about, where they built over several months, over several stipulations. All the stipulation matches were arrived at kind of organically, and then the big blow up. So, Brian, any other thoughts on what might be keeping feuds from being what they once were?
Well, the two guys you mentioned, Jericho and Michaels, they're kind of two of the last of the vestiges of the old school talents that could really work in this unscripted way. The creative process has changed so dramatically, even since 2010, even since I was there. Well, I worked at WWE during the aughts, and even then, you still it was in like the immediate post Vince Russo era. You had a small creative team, or what you used to call a booking committee, a group of people. Now the show is written like any other television show. They have a writer's room. They got a giant staff of writers. I think it waters things down. It sort of makes everything just sort of like lukewarm. Nothing, things don't jump out as much. I also think in the past, and I don't think this has been mentioned yet, but the way things were structured, things moved much slower. So you didn't have pay-per-views every single month, or even if you did, you had more patience in how things played out. So you wanted a feud needed to run the entire house show horn. So you needed to hit every town, every city with the same match. And so by the nature of the way the business was run, the feuds took longer. And when they take longer, they build up more heat. Now it just seems like everything is more compartmentalized. Okay, we're going to do this for 2 months. Then we're going to do that for 2 months. And nothing feels organic. Everything is like, okay, we got to get on to the next thing. We have to, that we have an order, and it's all very.
There's so much TV now. I mean, you were able to stretch those feuds out because, when I was growing up in the 80s, the payoff to a feud would be maybe your local house show, right. Saturday night's main event, maybe,
Yeah, they had a gap in between. I mean, there was a gap in between, let's say, WrestleMania and SummerSlam, even before they had King of the Ring, where your whole business was house shows. So you were shooting angles on television that were strictly going to pay off at untelevised house shows, and that was it. And if you didn't go there, you didn't see it.
Yeah. It is a shame because I think this award, maybe more than anything else, is what wrestling is all about, right? I mean, it is about the feuds. That's why you watch more. And I think maybe it's another testament to how the sport is changing. Even calling the sport feels weird these days, but I feel like we've moved away from that, and now it is almost like this American Idol kind of. You've got judges watching from the sides and assigning a point value for moves and And we've gotten away from, at the end of the day, what we're supposed to be doing is selling people on wanting to see two people beat each other up. And it's become less about that, less about the fight and more about sort of the performance, which is, I think, a shame. Next award is let me run through all the other feud of the year runners up. So Okada Mega at number 1, Charlotte and Sasha at number 2. That's kind of interesting. I think I went over these. Punk, Cena 3, Owens, Zayn, and at 4 with 10%, and others made 47%. Woman of the Year, Harry, who came in number 1. This one's interesting because maybe more than any other category, this is not just a category, but a division that changed so much over the decade. I mean, you think about women's wrestling in WWE in 2010 versus 2019; they are worlds apart.
Right, and your woman of the decade is Charlotte Flair with 33%. And I think back to 2014 when she won the Rookie of the Year award, which was exactly 39 years after Ric Flair had won that award. And I think people appreciate that Charlotte didn't really start with a huge bang. They didn't have like terrific expectations for her. She played it like just under the radar at first. She didn't go with the Flair surname, et cetera. But her career has been one of firsts. So the one thing that really comes to my mind is her main event match against Sasha Banks at Hell in a Cell back in 2016. That's a really historic moment. And I guess also the three-way match at WrestleMania 35 with Becky Lynch and Ronda Rousey. And one thing we're speculating on is maybe for the 2030 awards, when we talk about the decade of the 2020s, will the Woman of the Year award thing seem obsolete? Will women be in the mix, not necessarily competing against men in the ring, but competing against men for the Wrestler of the Year award or Wrestler of the Decade award?
Yeah, it's a really good point. Just earlier today, a little bit of a spoiler, looking ahead to our next issue after this one. I was interviewing Nyla Rose for a hot seat interview in a upcoming issue, and we talked about it. I mean, the last couple of years have been so transformational for wrestling, and I feel like the last 6 months even more so, right? When you've got somebody like Nyla Rose wearing a women's championship in a major promotion, and then you've got Tessa Blanchard as the heavyweight champion of another major promotion. It just feels like it's been completely turned on its ear, and in a good way. I mean, I don't think there's a downside to any of this. This is all just really super cool stuff. I do think Charlotte was the right pick here. I do think because of how much women's wrestling progressed in the latter half of the decade, some recency bias is to be expected. Otherwise, do we end up with like Candice Michelle as one of the runners up or somebody like that, or I guess she might have been earlier than that, but certainly like
around at the beginning of the decade. I don't think she was.
She might have been. I might be thinking Michelle McCool, but who was a fine wrestler. But it really did change so much. It's worth pointing out there is some representation from those earlier years on the list. AJ Lee is at 9% in the second runner-up spot. I don't know if I buy that, but I guess she gets some credit for getting some of this going. She certainly, takes credit for it. And Gail Kim, which is an interesting name, one that's still hanging around, and very much when there were still the bra and panties fights and pillow fights and all that going on in WWE, she was doing something completely different over on Impact. So good to see her get some recognition. But Charlotte, you mentioned it really was a lot of the decade. I mean, she's been around for a while now. You take that for granted, but I even think back to the NXT match with Natty, where Natty had Brett in her corner and Charlotte had Ric Flair in her corner, and that was at the time a real kind of a historic and important and terrific match. By today's standards, maybe wouldn't stand out that much, but at the time, it was really something special. And that was, I think, before the halfway point of the decade. So, what's your take on Charlotte winning Woman of the Decade, Brian?
I think this also is one of the things I looked at and I thought, okay, recency bias is thankfully not playing as big of a factor as I would have been afraid of, because then Becky Lynch also would have run away with it. And I think the fact that Charlotte doubled her numbers showed that a lot of people were very kind of circumspect about this, which is good, because she was the most consistent, Charlotte, through the decade. And I don't think she ever reached the heights that Becky Lynch is at right now. I don't think anybody would say that she did. But in my eyes, she is not only, one of the most consistent and talented female performers, but performers, period, that WWE has. She is one of the top all-around talents that they have, and she really is her father's daughter. And this is like the Cena one for me. Like, when it comes to consistency, I can't think of who else this should go to.
Yeah, I'll throw out one name that, I guess in a decade award maybe wouldn't make a lot of sense to people, because her run was so relatively short, but it was so impactful. I can't help but think that maybe Ronda Rousey should have cracked that top 3, top 5, maybe in place of an AJ Lee. Just again, maybe her run was just a year or so long, but you can't take for granted what she did in that year, how important it was. Women headlining a WrestleMania, I don't know that happens without Ronda Rousey in the mix. And even this wouldn't help, her case for getting this award. But even before her WWE run, you forget what a mainstream phenomenon she was in the sports world, and even outside of that. I mean, Ronda Rousey was a big deal, and a terrific pro wrestler. Just took like few others. So I wouldn't mind. If I had a vote, I'd have her in that top mix. Moving on, match of the year. This is an interesting one, and certainly not a case of recency bias. But I do think fans got this one right as well. What won match of the decade, Harry?
Yeah, you're right, Al. That goes all the way back to 2010, WrestleMania 26, The Undertaker versus Shawn Michaels, the rematch, because they had originally wrestled each other at WrestleMania 25 the previous year. And I think there were a lot of comparisons between this match and the match in which Shawn Michaels retired Ric Flair back at WrestleMania 24.
Which was a match of the previous decade.
Yes, I'm glad you pointed that out. So, and one thing to mention, got to say about Shawn Michaels is how many times he's been involved in the match of the year. Just an incredible streak. I believe it's 7 times. I think it was a consecutive streak, 7 times Shawn Michaels was in the PWI match of the year. And just for the sheer drama and a lot of people feeling that was going to be his last match. I'm not surprised that came in number 1, other than the fact that it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, interestingly, his match with The Undertaker at WrestleMania 25, which I think was the better of the two matches. I think most people agree was the better of the two matches. And in my money, I still call it the greatest match I've ever seen. And I was lucky enough to be there in person. Did not win match of the decade in the previous decade. As I said, that went to Michaels and Flair, which was also a terrific match. But it's almost a little depressing to talk about this, because it makes you realize that, this previous decade was the end of the Michaels era, but for that very forgettable, it was a Saudi match, right? Back in 2018. But yeah, man, Shawn was really something else. And, I think it's fair to say this is probably the last time he'll be getting an award like this in the pages of our magazine. So kind of a bummer, Brian.
Yeah, and I also have to kind of really step out from the pack here for a lot of reasons. I mean, I think this award is very subjective, obviously. I mean, they all are to a degree, but it also depends on, I don't know, some people just like certain matches for certain reasons. Like me personally, I wouldn't even call Michaels Taker Undertaker's best match of the decade. Like I would have gone with Undertaker versus CM Punk at WrestleMania. For me, that was a more.
Finally, we disagree on something.
Well, no, and not only that, but where's John Cena and AJ Styles from SummerSlam? I think 2016. I mean, that was unbelievable. And you also had these two guys that represented for the longest time the two closest things to competing companies in the wrestling business. So maybe it's because I feel like the match of the year or decade or anything, or what makes a great match, for me, it isn't just about the moves they do or the excitement in the match. It's also the magnitude of the match, the gravity of it, the importance of it, like the buzz around it. It's everything. It's the big match feel. So I haven't even mentioned what my pick would have been. My pick didn't even make it on this list. And it's, for God's sake, I mean, John Cena versus The Rock at MetLife Stadium, WrestleMania 29. I mean, that was, for my money, the 2010s version of, Hulk Hogan versus Andre the Giant.
More so than their first match in 2012?
Yeah, I would go with the second match, because I think the story, too, of Cena avenging the loss and proving that this was his era, on top of everything else, I think that gave even more juice to the match.
Well, I got to disagree with you, and I think that you almost make the argument for Undertaker and Shawn Michaels being the best match in part because of the stakes. I mean, not only was it the main event of a WrestleMania, even without a title on the line, this was clearly the main event of that show. It closed the show, as well it should have, but the stakes were super high in that this is when the streak was still around. So the streak was on the line, and Shawn Michaels' career was on the line, and I think that is. Again, in terms of like a great classic wrestling tropes, that's it. When you have the stakes that are so high that either outcome is almost unthinkable, they accomplish that. Now, I actually think that the story and the hype for this match was the best part of the match, because the match, which was a terrific match, I think in some ways didn't quite live up to it. But as a total package, main event WrestleMania, super high stakes, the history, I thought I remember more than most years there being so much conversation about this match in the weeks leading up to WrestleMania. I mean, I remember being in, I guess I was in San Antonio, like the weekend before this WrestleMania, and just hanging out with friends. And it was all, what could possibly happen, either this or that. And again, both outcomes were almost implausible. So I think I get where you're coming from, Brian, and I don't agree with all of them here, but I don't have a huge problem with this one. Other matches, and they got big votes. Not surprisingly, Okada Omega, I guess this would have been 2 or 3. It's June 9th, 2018. Came in first runner-up. Okada Omega came in second runner-up. This would be their first match, I believe. This was the Tokyo Dome match from 2017. CM Punk and John Cena from Money in the Bank 2011. Terrific match. I do believe that this belongs on the list. I got to say, I don't think I'd have both Okada Omega matches. I do think you should have one of them there. I don't know, flip a coin. But I would have opened up a spot for something else, maybe Styles and Cena, which you touched on. But you know what? We talk about there not have been a bunch of great feuds in the 2010s. There were a ton of great matches in the 2010s.
Yes. Definitely.
Yeah. Let me go over match of the year here. So here are the match of the years for every year since 2010. 2010 was Undertaker Shawn Michaels, which was match of the decade. Punk and Cena, 2011. Undertaker Triple H, Hell in a Cell, for WrestleMania, what was that, 28? Love that match. I might have made space for it in here. John Cena, Daniel Bryan at SummerSlam, another terrific match, 2013. 2014, kind of a weird year. John Cena and Bray Wyatt, which we're about to see at WrestleMania again. But this was actually Payback, which was a really fun match. That was the last man standing match. Bayley and Sasha Banks in 2015, the first time a women's match, won this, and I think they were also first runner-up that year. Styles and Cena at SummerSlam was in 2016. Okada Omega 2017, Okada Omega 2018, and last year Cody Rhodes versus Dustin Rhodes. And again, if you include all the runners-up and beyond that, really a terrific decade for matches were the 2010s. Next up is Tag Team of the Year. Who got that? Tag Team I keep on saying Tag Team of the Year, or it should be Tag Team of the Decade. Who won Tag Team of the Decade, Harry?
Okay. That was really no surprise to me. The New Day with 26%. You have to consider this was yet another decade that couldn't be considered a tag team heyday. It's been a long time, since the 1980s. But anybody who in this day...
2000. Come on.
Well, I guess so.
Christian Hardy's, yeah.
Yeah. Anybody who surpasses Demolition's record that held for 30 years in this day and age, 478 days to become the longest reigning tag team champions. So for that alone, I think they really deserve this award. And the fact that they became sort of a power block unto themselves. They kind of reminded me of the Fabulous Freebirds in the UWF way back then, when Terry Gordy was the UWF champion, Buddy Roberts was TV champion, where they became more than a six-man. They became a faction unto themselves. So I think I have to agree with that placement.
Yeah, I do too. I do feel like it's sort of a de facto tag team of the decade because it wasn't a real strong decade for tag teams. Probably, again, if you break it into 10-year segments, the weakest, I don't know, in the modern era of tag team wrestling, right? If you think 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts, and then the 2010s, I can't remember a time that was worse than this for tag teams. Thankfully, it seems to be turning around, certainly with AEW putting a ton of emphasis on tag teams. So come 2030, it might be a very different story. But I think you can make a good point that of New Day kind of being more than the sum of their parts, right? And becoming kind of wielding a lot of influence in WWE. You know, I touched on John Cena being such a merchandise seller. New Day was too. I mean, they were a big act over the last decade, and I think part of their success story, even if it isn't tallied in their tag team title reigns, but part of it is Kofi Kingston, and Kofi Kingston winning the big one and winning the world title at WrestleMania last year. We can quibble about how successful that ultimately was, but that a member of a tag team, and still a member of a tag team, I think he still is kind of predominantly looked at as a tag team wrestler, reached the very top of the WWE mountain, I think is a credit to the act, to the New Day, not just to Kofi. So, Brian, any thoughts on this award?
Well, as far as New Day winning it, I can't really argue against that because they were dominant for very long. They were hugely popular. I mean, there were periods where I would say they were the most over act in the whole company, which doesn't say a lot about the main event picture, but that did happen. And I think that they kind of took what started out as a lame gimmick and they really ran with it. I mean, my understanding of it too is a lot of the creative around it came from them. Like they really took lemons and made lemonade. I mean, that's really what, and they did a great job. But I will say this, one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, and I'm really surprised, especially when it comes to consistency, like we talked about talents that are consistent throughout the decade. I mean, I don't think there's ever been a tag team in WWE history that has stayed there as long as the Usos have. I mean, they have been there. They were there through the entire decade, winning titles, beating top teams, always in the mix, always in the running. They were faces, they were heels, they did it all. And I don't know if I still would. I still don't think I'd give it to them over the New Day. But the fact that they didn't even really have a showing is surprising to me.
Yeah, I agree. And they were also a super popular act way back when. That match of the year from 2014, John Cena and Bray Wyatt. One of the highlights of that was the Usos getting involved, and I think this is when Wyatt was with the Wyatt family, and the Usos come out to kind of help Cena, and they were kind of briefly this sort of alliance of super over baby faces, and Usos were selling a ton of merch and were hugely over. So, and that's way back in 2014, and as you said, they're still very much relevant now. So I agree. To round out the list, it is again, I mean, kind of unspectacular. Young Bucks at first runner-up, which is not surprising, and you got to think that if they stay on the pace that they're on, they'll have an even bigger 2020s this decade. Just this past Saturday, had a match with Hangman Page and Kenny Omega that some people are calling the greatest tag team match of all time. So a good way to start off the decade, I'd say. The Briscoes at 13%. Interesting. In one respect, it's nice, to throw a bone to Ring of Honor that was around all decade doing their thing, and Briscoes remained an important big part of Ring of Honor throughout the whole decade. I wonder how much of that is of their own choosing, and I wonder how much of that is the fact that at various times of the decade they were not exactly employable anywhere else. So that's part of it. And then the Shield at 10%. I think of the Shield less as a tag team than a faction, kind of like the NWO. So I don't know if I'm on board with that one. Maybe that's where you make space for an Usos. You bump the Briscoes down one and put the Usos in that second or third runner-up spot. So yeah, I agree. And finally, the final award, and in a moment here, we're going to be hearing from the winner of this award, who I had the pleasure of speaking to, who is the 2010s Wrestler of the Decade, Harry.
Okay, drum roll, please. And it wasn't.
That's later.
That's a big shocker to me. AJ Styles with 29%. And I have to go back to the podcast from a couple of months ago where we spoke, and you asked me who I thought the wrestler of the decade should be. I think I said John Cena just because of the star power and gave a nod to Brock Lesnar. I didn't really seriously consider AJ Styles, but our readership definitely did. And you have to say, from 2010 to 2020, he was busy the whole time. Really, he was rewarded for being the workhorse. He dominated TNA. He showed up in New Japan, excelled there, conquered WWE, bypassed NXT, treated like a first-class talent from the time that he arrived in WWE. So looking back on it, I might have to change my initial feeling and agree with the readers on this one.
Yeah, I'm with you, and I think you and I were both thinking John Cena was the right choice here, but I after talking to AJ and putting together the interview that's going to run with him that'll accompany his award, I really kind of dug into his decade, and when you really think about it, what it means to be the wrestler of the decade. It's hard to argue against him, and you'll hear in the interview one of the questions I asked him is, what does he think he was wrestler of the decade, and what did he do, to accomplish that? And he talked about something that I think you brought up before, consistency. I think he said over the course of the entire 10 years, the longest he was out was something like a month, and otherwise he was just working. And reached the very top of not just WWE, but when you look at his decade, he started the year, so the January 1st, 2010, he was the TNA World Heavyweight Champion. This is back when I think we were still calling it a world title. And this is when TNA was still running pretty hot. This was right when they were about to go live on Monday nights, and they brought in Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff and Jeff Hardy. For better or for worse, some of those decisions weren't the right ones, but TNA was probably as relevant as they had ever been back then. So being the guy there was still a big deal. and I think he held the title at least one more time over there before leaving the company in 2014, I believe, 13, 14. Went over to Ring of Honor, right back into the main event scene. Didn't win the title there, but was headlining some big Ring of Honor cards. From there to New Japan, won the IWGP title. I think really kind of planted the seeds for what we've seen the last 2 years. I think that's where he kind of really cemented himself as one of the best in the world. And then we know the second half of the decade, everything he did in WWE. Worth pointing out that was almost unthinkable at a time. The idea of AJ Styles being in WWE was just crazy. I mean, WWE was not touching guys from TNA, much less a guy with a heavy Southern accent who was whatever he was, 5'9", 5'10". He was everything that WWE was not. And a lot of folks didn't think he would ever get a shot. And if he did get a shot, nobody could have thought that he'd make it to where he is. He's about to, work another WrestleMania with The Undertaker. So I do think when you break it up, you look at AJ every year of the decade and what AJ did, and I think it makes all the sense in the world that he'd get this award. How about you, Brian?
Well, it doesn't make sense to me, and I'm going to tell you why. Here's my thing, and nothing against AJ Styles. I think if you were to say who is the best all-around in-ring performer in the business, he'd probably get my vote. But when you're talking about wrestler of the decade, I really believe it has to be somebody that when you look back and you say, which one wrestler defined this decade, like embodied the decade in wrestling? And I just don't see that as AJ Styles. I mean, yeah, he had a great career throughout the decade, but for the first half of the decade, he was working, and again, no offense here, he was working in places where the majority of casual fans may not have even seen him. And there are a lot of WWE fans who thought he was a new guy when he popped on the scene in 2015. So for me, it's got to be Brock Lesnar, without question. And regardless of how many title defenses he had, and I strongly agree with you that it was a bad move to allow him to get away with that, regardless of how the fans want him off their TV and all that stuff that I said. He has dominated the decade in a way that no other WWE talent has. He's in a class by himself. In an age when talent is constantly getting overexposed by being on TV all the time and losing to everybody, he is special. He is something special in this day and age, which is very, very rare. And from 2012 right up till now, he has been there, whether fans wanted him there or not. He has been there beating people, winning titles, doing what he said he was going to do, crushing people, spiking ratings. And I think that, to me, epitomizes what a wrestler of the decade should be.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Harry and I were going for Cena. You went for Lesnar, and the fans went for AJ Styles. And in order, the awards were AJ Styles winning it, first runner-up Brock Lesnar, second runner-up John Cena. So we were all in kind of the same stratosphere. I don't think I think reasonable people could disagree. I think fans were largely right on this one. The other top vote getter at I guess this would be the third runner-up spot is Okada at 10%. Given what he did over at least the last half of the decade, I have no problem with that either. I mean, really kind of etched himself among the all-time greats in Japan. So I think he belongs on this list. But yeah, I got to say, from where we started until now, I kind of had a change of heart. I think fans, by and large, got most of this right. When I look at it, I mean, my immediate reaction when I saw some of these names, it was, again, recency bias. But then when you really break it down, I think they considered this a lot better than I maybe gave them credit for. So kudos to you, fans. Brian, thank you so much. Harry, thank you not just for doing the show, but compiling all this. And fans could check it out in the latest magazine, which I believe is now available for digital download and will be available in print before long. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you, Al.
And thank you, Harry. Let's hear from the PWI Wrestler of the Decade, AJ Styles.
Yeah. I remember, I think the first time I talked to you for Pro Wrestling Illustrated was back in 2010 when you were the first TNA wrestler to rank number one in the PWI 500, and that was the very beginning of the decade. I guess I'll start there. I mean, what do you remember about where you were at the beginning of the decade? And how are you different now 10 years later?
Well, I don't remember exactly where I was at in 2010. I know I was at TNA. That's about all I can remember what was going on there. But man, as far as change goes, I think I've matured so much in this business and understood what really draws people into a match rather than, just crazy things that I've done where you get yourself hurt. But it's just the little things mean the most, and it's people don't realize these little things. They just know it was a good match, but it was the little things that can take a great match and make it an unbelievable one.
Yeah. One thing I remember from that interview with you back then was I think concussions were just kind of really beginning to be a topic in wrestling, and asking you about your style at the time. And I'm paraphrasing to an extent, but I remember you saying something to like, I really don't think about it now. I'll deal with that later. I've got to go out there and give it 100%. And honestly, my health or my long-term health isn't that big a concern. Does that sound like where you were at 10 years ago, and how maybe are you different from that perspective now?
Well, I got to tell you, man, that's kind of still the same way I am. I'm still not worried about cushions. I go out there and I still try to give you 100%. Is it a little bit harder now? Yeah, I'm older. So, but my mentality is still the same. Like, I'm going to go out there and bust my tail and do what I do, try to put on a great match, an unbelievable match. And, and not worried about getting injured and not worrying about, a concussion or something like that. My job is to entertain. And I got to do that to the best of my abilities, or I just can't live with myself. When you worry about getting hurt, when you worry about getting a concussion like that, that's usually when you get one, because you're going to hesitate. So I don't worry about it, man. Let's go out there and perform.
Yeah. So the first several years of the decade, you were still in TNA. I guess that would have been maybe the second half of your run in TNA. And at the very beginning of it, you may not remember, but you guys were just starting to get on Monday nights, and a lot of big names coming in, Hulk Hogan, Eric Bischoff, all of that. Do you look back fondly on that early part of the decade and your involvement in TNA? Or given that, in the end you had to leave, is it something that kind of leaves a sour note with you?
Well, I had high hopes for when, in 2010, when all that was going on, now that you've reminded me. And but, it really led down to the downfall. Instead of being TNA, they tried to be something that they weren't. And they didn't trust the people that got them to the game. And now those people are here in WWE with me. It just goes to show that it didn't have anything to do with the talent. It had something to do with the person who was calling all the shots, not just these shots, but all the shots, when they had no business doing something like that. So, it was definitely a different time back then, and a very frustrating one at that. Now when I say, and that blame to me doesn't fall on, a lot of people like to blame Eric Bischoff. I would not put that blame on him. In fact, I enjoyed working with him, so I want to make that clear. Yeah.
So moving into kind of the middle part of the decade, you leave TNA, and then you go a number of places. You go back to Ring of Honor, do some work there, have some terrific matches, go to New Japan, win the IWGP title. That middle part, do you see it as really kind of transformative? I think a lot of fans see that as really having laid the foundation for what you did in the second half of 2010.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it was a chip on my shoulder, so I had a lot to prove, and I wanted to prove it as many places as I could. So while I was wrestling for Ring of Honor, I was also doing independence. And when then New Japan and I got together and we had a great relationship, that chip was still on my shoulder. I had something to prove. I worked my tail off, and I enjoyed it. It was a great experience for me to push myself and see what else I could accomplish. And it was a scary time at first because you didn't know what was going to happen. But I'm glad everything happened the way that it did. I have no regrets.
Yeah, these days I think a lot of people look to guys like Cody Rhodes and some others as the people who proved that you can make it independent and make something of yourself. But I think people forget that you did that first, years ahead of a lot of people. And I remember when you left TNA, and here's a guy who everybody kind of thinks of as one of the best in the world. Is he really going to just go work some indie dates? How is he going to put together a living? So was that scary for you, sort of not being attached to a major promotion? I know it wasn't long before you were, at least in New Japan, but there was some time there that you were just kind of floating, right?
Well, yeah, I'll tell you what the biggest difference is between Cody and I. Cody has his wife that he's got to support. I have, at the time when I left, I had 3 kids, and and my wife, of course. And so, that's scary when you don't know exactly where the money's going to come from, and you've got people to take care of. You got people that depend on you. It's scary. I was afraid, but at the same time, I bet on myself. I thought that I was better than what they were offering for me to stay at TNA. I didn't think it was right what they had offered, and in fact, it was a little insulting because I worked so hard for that company, and basically I was getting punished because of their mistakes.
Yeah,
but to answer your question, I was scared to death at first because I didn't have a home.
Was part of that maybe fearing or just believing that WWE wasn't interested? I mean, you had obviously been on the radar for a long time, and you joke about so many of those old TNA wrestlers being in WWE now, but the reality is that there was a long stretch there where it felt like WWE wouldn't touch anybody who was from TNA. So was that always the goal, or at some point did you maybe start to accept this is never going to happen for me?
Oh, I accepted the fact that I would never see a WrestleMania. I just accepted it, and I was okay with it. And in fact, when TNA and I departed, we left each other, got our divorce, if you will. I let WWE know and talk to someone and let them know that I don't have a contract with them anymore. It's over. It's done with. And so they knew there was. It seemed like there was a little bit of interest, but I guess not enough to follow through with. So that's when I went to Ring of Honor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you? What was that like? We didn't talk that much about it. That they're on some hard times now, but they were riding high for a while there, and I think you had a lot to do with helping them put them back on the map and laying claim to having somebody who at the time I think everybody or a lot of people thought one of the best in the world. So were you happy to go back there?
I was also happy to go back there because I still had a lot of friends there, and they always treated me really well when I was there, and I had so much respect for them. And that's still the same. I respect and love those guys up at Ring of Honor, and hope they continue to, keep moving forward. It's not easy in this business, but I think, they've been around longer than TNA or Impact Wrestling, whatever you want, and not many people realize it. So they've been through hard times before, and I don't know where they're at now, but I hope they're happy with. Maybe they're not happy with where they are, but maybe where they're going.
Yeah.
I enjoyed my time at Ring of Honor. There was a lot of great matches that I haven't got, and guys I got to get in the ring with.
Yeah. And then obviously the second half of the decade, largely in WWE. You've been there now, what, 5 years? Is this?
It'll be 4 years in January, I think.
4 years, okay.
Yeah.
So
is 2016. Yeah.
Is it everything you dreamed this would be? I mean, do you look back on the last 4 years as the most fulfilling of your career?
I would say so. I mean, it's different here, man. It's a beast, and you don't realize how big this company is until you get here, and how powerful it is. It's all over the world. It's all over the world. Like it's New Japan is mostly in Japan, or all in it's primarily in Japan. Some in the States, maybe in England a little bit, but other than that, kind of fizzle out. AEW, maybe in the States, maybe a little bit in Japan, North America kind of thing, but after that, it fizzles out,
Mm-hmm.
WWE is so global, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Like you can't comprehend how big it is, but it is everything I thought it would be. And I'm happy to be here, man. I enjoy my time here. I feel like I've been here for years, more than just 4.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a reputation for a lot of, great wrestlers like yourself that when you come to WWE, you have to kind of dumb it down some, and you don't get to put on the great performances or work the style that you did before you got here. But you've been able to have some of the best matches of your career, if not the very best, there in WWE against all different kinds of wrestlers, coming right in and working with Chris Jericho and John Cena and having these match of the year matches and 5-star matches. So what's been behind that? Is it just not the case that exists, that this reputation for WWE maybe holding back wrestlers from giving their full athletic performance out there, or will you dedicate saying, no, I'm determined to show my very best here?
I think as I've gotten older, I realize what's more important, and like you got to sell, man. That means you can't do some crazy thing and then come back like it never happened. Like I understand that there's a psychology. It plays a huge part in what we do, but that doesn't mean you can't do something cool. You just got to make it sense, when you do it. And people want that, whether they admit it or not. They really want that because it makes sense to them. And as far as dumbing it down, that may be an old school thing that was said before, because these guys and girls can go. They can all go up here. Now, there may be some guys who haven't, done the things that we've done on the independents before as far as moves and stuff like that. But that's just showing someone how to do it, and you're rocking and rolling again. So, I disagree with that nowadays. I think there's too many guys that have been on the indies. And even when, I think from NXT to WWE, that psychology will change as you get older, but it makes sense to me that it changes. There's a different kind of audience from here to there, and again, it's that when I talked about the little things. It's the little things that make that psychology work, and we can do whatever we want to do as long as we tell you exactly how it's supposed to be, And I don't think that requires dumbing it down. I think it just means being smarter than the average worker or the average fan even.
Yeah. So you signed a new contract last year, was it? And I remember you saying at the time, I think in social media, something to the extent that you expected this would be your last contract, or at the very least that you expected you'd finish your career in WWE. So
yes,
here starting a new decade, now in your 40s, do you feel like you're kind of winding down?
I think it's one of those things where I'm really don't want to miss another game of one of my kids are playing, or an opportunity to spend time with my wife. Like there's a lot of that stuff happening, and I've sacrificed a lot, and my family has as well, so that we can earn a living doing this, and that the end goal, of course, is to retire and still be able to walk and run and do things with your kids and your family. So I'm just trying to find that happy medium where I'm not so banged up I can't, but banged up enough where I know it's time to retire.
Yeah. Do you think at the beginning of the next decade you're still doing this, or what are you doing in 2030?
In 2030, I hope that I am. 10 years ago. That means, that means my daughter will be 15. What would I be doing? I hope that I am watching everything, like whatever competition she's doing or game she's playing. I don't miss a thing. In 10 years, my son's going to be 24. Is he getting married? That's
right,
all these kind of things to look forward to. and I will not be in a ring competing. I can tell you that. There's
you can
no
say it
way.
definitively. I mean, you see Triple H out there. You see The Undertaker.
Different
guys
animal.
in their 50s. Yeah, that's not you.
Different animal, man. I worry about when I can't be me anymore, and I don't want to go to the point where people expect something that I just can't do anymore. I don't want to be that guy. They're expecting this guy. I can't be him anymore. I don't want to do that to them. These fans have been good to me for, over a decade, and I don't want to disappoint them. So when that time comes, I'm just going to hang them up, and that'll be the end of it.
Is there anything left for you to do here in this decade, if this is your final decade in wrestling?
Sometimes you don't know what that next goal is or the next step is until you just kind of step on it and you go, oh shoot, I think I want to do this. I'm not saying this, but like a lot of sometimes it's like, oh, I think I want to act. I want to give it a shot. They'll get that taste for it, and the next thing you know, but I don't know what that is for me yet. And I still want to be as good as I can be. I feel like I've accomplished a lot, but how big of a star can I be here in the WWE? What can I do? Yeah. So there's the little things like that I got my eye on, but we'll see where it leads.
Yeah. Do you feel like the wrestler of the decade, like you did have the best past 10 years of anybody in the business?
I'm sure there are many other people that really had some great decades. I'm sure there's other performers that did well, and the only thing I can say, I've been consistent for 10 years. Been at the top of my game for 10 years and busting my tail for 10 years. So at least I can say that. Now, or I think so and so, but I never took not a year off from 2010 to 2020. I never was injured where I had to take off, or I was hurt but not injured. Maybe I think maybe my longest time out was probably 4 months or 4 weeks.
That's wild, especially working your style. I mean, I hadn't thought about that, but that's a real testament. Wow.
I think I tore my hip labrum, and that took me out a couple weeks. But other than that, that's about as long as it's been.
Yeah. Well, the flip side of that is, has it worn on you? I mean, could you have used a break? I mean, is there feeling any burnout over basically not getting much of a break for 10 years?
I enjoy those. I enjoy it, man. I like that. This is what I do, and I feel like I need to earn that paycheck. I don't want people to say, well, he doesn't do this or he doesn't do that. Like, yeah, but I'm sacrificing. I gotta be able to say that I earned it. It wasn't given to me. I earned that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Thanks for taking the time. Congratulations on being our wrestler of the decade.
I appreciate it. Okay, bud. I'll talk to you later, man.
Okay, congrats. Take care.